Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for joining us this evening for this special event on the elections, and in particular, the topic is dismantling Westminster politics, Muslims, elections, and power building. So, for those of you who don't know, CAGE is hosting this event tonight. CAGE is an advocacy organization that exists in order to empower communities impacted by what is known as the global war on terror. So policies and practices of states that ostensibly target Muslims, whether it's through the setting up of unlawful camps at Guantanamo Bay or through the enactment of counter-terrorism legislation that targets predominantly Muslim communities. So we have three speakers tonight who are going to join us. Sorry, my name is Asim Qureshi. For those of you who don't know, I'm the research director at CAGE. But joining us as our expert speakers, we have Arzu Merali from the Islamic Human Rights Commission, an organization that's been campaigning against Islamophobic policies globally for well over 20 years. We also have Dr. Khadija Shayal, the author of the book on Muslim identity politics, and last but not least, Fahad Ansari, who is a solicitor at Riverway Law. He successfully represented many individuals impacted by UK counter-terrorism policies. So just as an introduction to this event, this is in many ways an exceptional election because there is a background noise that is taking place that has very much impacted on the way in which many communities, not just Muslims, have understood what their relationship to this election is. And that is, of course, the current ongoing live stream genocide taking place in Gaza by the settler colonial apartheid state of Israel. And the reality is that pretty much every single major political party in the UK has played an active role in normalizing the settler colonial apartheid state. Tories and Labour in particular have revealed their hand early by providing unequivocal support to Israel. If anything, I think Palestine as an issue has exposed the cruel reality of our political and legal systems, as we see that these very systems that there is often homage paid to as being kind of the route through which we can hold the things that we hold dear to account, we see that these systems and structures not only become complicit, become active participants in the violence that we see around the world. And so we wanted to put on this event in order to attempt to conceive of politics outside of normalizing a two-party structure, especially when that two-party structure gives us the option of the devil or the deep blue sea. And it's really with that in mind that I'm hoping our three speakers tonight will help provide not only an analysis of where we go wrong by focusing so much on just the elections, but also helping us to find a way forward. So what are the possibilities on the horizon that exist beyond simply voting for Labour or Tories and putting all of our political eggs in these very, very limited baskets? Now, about a month ago, Dr. Khadija Shayal, she wrote an excellent thread on Twitter, which I'm sure one of my colleagues at CAGE can post on the thread again, explaining that the traditional engagement of Muslim communities with the first past the post political system that we have in this country, through things like initiatives like Muslim Vote and others, it's nothing actually that new. And so, Khadija, I just wanted to bring you in first to ask you, first of all, what are the limitations of this current political system in terms of Muslim representation?
Assalamualaikum, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank
you.
You.
Okay? Yeah, Assalamualaikum, Asim, and Assalamualaikum, everybody. Yeah. So first past the post. I'm assuming everyone here is familiar with the system. It's a very simple system on the face of it. It's basically what we can summarize as winner takes all, right? So um, uh, you have any number of candidates in a constituency who put themselves forward, and as long as they fulfill the criteria, they get their names on the ballot paper, and the electorate get to choose, right? Now, if um, it literally can come down to one vote, right? Um, Between a winner and all the runners up. And on that basis, it's often characterized as being a system where a lot of votes get wasted. Because if you haven't voted for the winner, it's kind of like your voice wasn't heard at all, right? Um, so if you look at the history of first past the post in the UK, we see that it was introduced for the general elections in the late 19th century. And the reason and the circumstances within which it was introduced under an initiative of the then Conservative Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was uh, because of anxieties that people had um, in the elite and the ruling classes, essentially the privileged classes from the Tories and the Liberals, who were the two major parties at the time, around the extension of franchise. So basically, workers were getting the vote. What's that going to mean for us? And first past the post was presented as a way of ensuring the dominance of the two major parties. And that's exactly what it does. It was designed to do that. And it does what it says on the tin, essentially. So, um, yeah, our engagement as Muslims with this electoral system, well, not just Muslims, minorities in general. It's designed um, to maximize, to engineer the continued dominance of the majority parties and to minimize the impact that minority voices have at elections, right? And an election is one day well, now it's every 5 years, could be every 4 or 5 years prior to that. And in that one day, there's a lot of build up, but ultimately, when the votes are all counted and everybody goes back home, we've got the same two parties um, arguing with each other in Parliament. Um, I hate to be depressing, but that's what it is. Um, so what do minority voices do? What do we do as members of minority communities who have issues that we care about and we want to be heard and we want to make an impact? What people tend to do is group together, right, to make their voices heard. So you find other like-minded voices. So in the past, those of you who remember the Iraq War, you had the Respect Coalition, right, where people from Stop the War, people from Muslim organizations, other relevant organizations, I think the CND, got together and said, we want to make an impact at the ballot box. We want to put forward candidates, and we will be stronger if we do this together. They made some noise. They had a bit of impact. They had, I think, one MP elected. Was it just Galloway? I don't know if there was another one that was elected. And it's been written in the history books. But did they change the course of history?
Sorry, Khadija. I know you were mid-sentence when unfortunately the space closed. So I don't know if you want to carry on the thought that you had started. But my apologies for that.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. I forgot what I was talking
No,
about.
it's quite all right. I think we got the main thrust of what you were saying in
Yep.
relation to you basically said that there is a limitation, you know,
Right.
that is built into the system that
Yep.
it is created as a
It's
two-party system. So I guess
absolutely.
the follow-up to that would be, well, then doesn't that make it even more important that Muslims and other minority groups engage with those two particular parties?
That's a really, really interesting thought. And actually, I was thinking about this just a few minutes ago, actually. Obviously, in the run up to elections in the Muslim community, as with all communities, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of interest, debate, discussion. We have interventions from scholars and community leaders. Historically, we've had the argument made that voting is haram, right? Um, in this election, I've seen much more strongly than ever before the argument that actually voting is some people have classified it as wajib, right? It's an obligation on us, and the argument that this um, position relies on is the idea that, well, if you don't vote for the lesser of two evils, then essentially your vote, again, it relies on an understanding of first past the post. Essentially, your vote is counted. It's pretty much as though you voted for the incumbent, right? For the ruling party. So to wind back to which is really interesting because it shows that we've understood the system. It shows that we know how it works and we're fully aware of it. But so the reason why I've gone on this tangent and winding back to your question about why whether or not we should whether or not that's a reason for us to engage in the two main parties is because sure, I mean there's nothing to stop us doing that. Politics is there, and we all know that politics is a non-ideal space. So for people who, have high, particular aspirations in terms of the world that they want to see, there's politics is a space where there's necessarily going to be compromise. There's going to be give and take. That's what sort of being a human being and living in society is, in particular, a plural society. So, I mean, yes, there's nothing to stop you from doing that. But equally, by making that the totality of our aspiration and the focus of the complete focus or the primary or the predominant focus of what we're doing, we really are limiting the possibilities for bringing about any change. Because as I started off saying, woven into this very system, in its very design, is the hegemony of these two major parties, which philosophically or otherwise we might have major issues with. So yeah, I mean, I think, it's a yes and no answer, but I do think ultimately what I would say is that engaging in the two main political parties from the outset, making that our goal in terms of effecting change in the long run, it's sort of like you're really limiting your possibilities for reaching any sort of level of success or change by your own benchmarks from the very very beginning. And that so yeah, that doesn't inspire a huge amount of confidence, if I'm honest.
Right. No, jazakallah khair for that. And actually, the point that you make about some of the scholars who uh, make it wajib to vote, it's interesting, of course, because when something is classified as wajib, it means that you're potentially sinful
Right. Hmm.
for not having done that thing. And I was like, whenever that comes up, whenever I see it's being expressed, I always ask myself, well, what if we had a choice between like a one neo-fascist party as one kind of political party option, and the other as a kind of like a traditional fascist party as the other option. So like, is it sinful then to choose like the lesser of the two fascists in that circumstance? And I guess that brings me on to Sister Arzu, who's written a really fascinating piece, Revolutionary Politics in the Time of Genocide, Beyond the Fantasy of the Muslim Vote. And it's just, I guess my first question is for you, actually, would be to like take the question I asked to Khadija from a different perspective, which is, can actually these major political parties really ignore Muslims? I know we're a minority, but um, is it really possible for us to be completely ignored in terms of the types of power that we have in the UK right now?
I didn't catch the very last thing you said. What was the last bit of your question? Sorry.
No, no problem. I was just asking if it's possible for the two major political parties to actually ignore Muslims in the way that the electoral system has been set up.
Well, I think they can. They have been evidently ignoring Muslims and pretty much almost everybody else, if I'm honest. Khadija, you said when we started this that you were sounding depressing. I haven't even started yet. I will raise you. I mean, I think we're living in a system that, despite its protestations, and even when you look at the kind of majoritarian rhetoric that we've got going on, that would suggest that, okay, well, maybe we're moving into an era of some kind of far right resurgence. I think might actually be the right word, although the "re" may be contestable in that scenario. That actually, when push comes to shove, there isn't that much that grassroots movements can do to impact the system anymore. You know, even this kind of quote unquote new politics of the right that we're, I think, seeing unfolding quite rapidly. But let's see what happens on Thursday night. Is in itself a disruption. It's not a movement for something. It's a disruption where people are fed up of what's going on right now and are kind to just do what they can to express that, which we may come back to later as to what is Muslims' role in that in this country, or is there a role, or can they do something of equal disruption? And what would be the use of that? So, well, yes, ignored probably always. And I've got to the stage in my life where I've thought, well, as the articles kind of outlined, and in a kind of very pessimistic way, and I think in a way, Khadija, your thread was much more eloquent on this point. This idea of a Muslim vote has been going on for a long time. I do not mean the organisation, just the idea of a Muslim bloc vote in this country. And there has to be a point when the penny has dropped that it hasn't worked in terms of a strategy. And maybe we have to look at why very seriously, and also consider whether it's actually something of utility going forward in this country, whether we're talking about domestic issues or whether we're talking about the kind of international politics that I think a lot of us want. We want to be reconnected, not just as an ummah, but as a sort of a movement for a transformed future.
Yeah, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you're both saying. And it's such a staying with these stars, it's such an interesting thing, right? That when election season comes up, somehow, you know, the very figures who have been part of the architecture of Islamophobia in this country, I'm thinking specifically of people like Khalid Mahmoud here and many others, somehow find locus to the Muslim community again. So, we find that there's no politics in the mosque when it comes to talking about issues of civil liberties or human rights or genocide going on in Palestine, gets put aside, and these politicians find their way back into the mosque again during this election season and cycle. So, what does that tell us about, uh, the politics of the Muslim community and the way that it operates in relation to power itself?
So I think there's a few things that I've been trying to unpack of late, and looking back at my younger self and that kind of frustration I had about this kind of what you've described as mosque politics, or that, the organizational vote that did go 9 times out of 10, or probably more, to the Labour Party, right, over decades from the Muslim community. And I think I sort of, the penny dropped that, first of all, I've been quite arrogant in the way I'd gone about that, and that kind of thinking, well, how is it that you are, putting the ummah to one side and all this injustice and kind of just, delivering your vote, particularly obviously in the last 20 plus years, or in a time of the permanent wars, which specifically and blatantly and overtly target Muslims, right, and Muslimness and Islam. And then I kind of got to realizing that actually this whole kind of system, the way that you could be successful as a minoritized group or as a lobby or as a, work in a local constituency, is something that a lot of these mosque politics or, local community organizational politics have been actually very successful at. So on the one hand, we've been kind of having this pie in the sky conversation about a Muslim bloc vote and saying, you know, we haven't made the system work properly for us. And at the same time, kind of run roughshod over people who were actually making the politics work for them, right? Now, that's not to say that I completely endorse it or I'm saying, well, you know, it's all good and I was completely wrong and we were all wrong, etc., etc. But there is something to be said about the fact that people understood how to get however many concessions, whether we think they were worth it or not, whether it was to do with more visas or mosque extensions or, you know, halal meals at school or whatever sort of things have been thrown at the Muslim communities in these constituencies. They did manage to extract a fair bit out of the system. And I think what it boils down to is the fact that, you know, the communities understand that that's the best that they can do and they're making the best of it. And yeah, these guys will turn up, you know, forget about Khalid Mahmoud, Jack Straw. You know, there's a much bigger fish. Goodness only knows what Keir Starmer's been up to in Holborn and St Pancras. You know, I'm wondering come Thursday, you know, exactly what kind of dent the independent candidate would have made there, because again, it's that same sort of game being played everywhere. So it's the indictment of the system, really. It's the penny kind of having to drop that we can't, we can carry on playing this game and actually in a way, maybe, you know, that's the best we can do and we keep playing that game. But then what do we do instead to make the real politics work, if you like? How do we turn that, what's going on now, into kind of administrative issues that we can almost ignore and go for big picture politics that actually will ultimately change both systems here, but elsewhere as well, and that we can join the dots for these justice movements that we're all fighting for.
Yeah, that's really well put. And so, you know, coming back to you, Khadija, where is there a possibility, and if so, where does Muslim power exist then outside of Parliament? You know, you've written a whole book on Muslim identity politics. You've tracked and you know, kind of catalogued the various movements that took place. You know, those that were very much embedded in the democratic system and those outside of it. You know, kind of protest movements and so on and so forth. So, where do you see the potential for power for Muslims outside of this parliamentary process?
Yeah, so just to link back to something Arzu said, actually, excuse me. So, yeah, I think your analysis is spot on, but I would add to that it's actually in the system's interest to keep us preoccupied with whatever we can eke out of it in terms of, you know, local, whether it's bargains or, you know, agreements or whatever it is. You know, you mentioned visas, other things. You know, this is why, and so we have our local MPs or PPCs turning up at mosques, playing that game, Muslim or otherwise. Even those who run on a sort of a clean anti-establishment agenda, they're forced to play that game because that's the way the system is set up, right? And so that from the outset limits the possibilities of change. So to answer the question, yeah, I mean, we have a whole history of decades and decades where that was sort of the limit of our aspiration in terms of politics. You know, international issues were often raised, but sort of raised out of a sense of obligation with the undertone and the understanding that actually nothing's going to change in terms of foreign policy. But if we can get the best we can get out of our local MP in terms of, you know, planning permission for mosques or etc., whatever else it is we need locally, then great, we'll be comfortable, right? Yeah, I think we absolutely are at a position or at a point where we can ask ourselves, you know, why do we keep having to reinvent and polish up and make slicker the whole concept of Muslim vote every time we have a new election? You know, at the moment, with everything happening in Gaza, I think that there is an argument to be made for giving the main parties something of a bloody nose on election day. And if we can achieve that, then all well and good. But is that a long term? Is that something that that's going to change anything in the long term? No, it's not. Is it going to change our foreign policy? No, it's not. Historically, if we look at any major shift in political direction or within society, I really, I mean, I draw a blank when I try and think of anything that was achieved through the ballot box. There is nothing that comes to mind. It's always been grassroots movements that lead the way, that force direction, and then establishment politics follows suit because it has to, because it's left with no other option. There's this clip which I'm sure many of you will have seen, where Theresa May is being interrogated about where were you when apartheid in South Africa was being protested against. And she stumbles all over herself. She has nothing to say because she knows exactly where she was, right? And that to me is emblematic of what we need to think about when we want to think about bringing about change. It's not going to happen through the ballot box. And even if the ballot box has the power that we like to think it does, even if we were to disregard the history of how it is the way it is in terms of the electoral system, it's a once in 5 years event, after which MPs are beholden, who are elected as clean or as well-meaning as they might be. Anyone who's elected is then beholden to the agenda of their own party, right? So truly, we do need to think much bigger and much more clearly about where sort of firmer, foundational, broader, longer-lasting change can be effected. And it's certainly not at the ballot box, because that's designed, as I say, specifically to exclude minoritized, marginalized voices. So I think that the next question is to look inwards, to look at ourselves, to look at where our points of strength are, and how we can build on that in terms of raising our voices, building a momentum past the election date.
And Jazakumullah khair to both of you. And we're still waiting for Fahad to be available to speak. He just caught up for a moment. He's listening in, and hopefully we'll get him in soon. But let me just ask you both quickly: what opportunity does this moment in Palestine actually present us? Both of you have identified that really the Muslim kind of understanding of political engagement really ultimately comes down to local issues. That's how the vast majority of Muslim communities in the UK have interacted with their members of parliament. They've gone to them with a whole list of things that they're interested in, and often we know that international issues are among them, but what really moves them, as you both described, is perhaps a local issue that is affecting the local communities they come from and ameliorating their everyday conditions. But is this a different moment? Maybe if we can start with Sister Arzu and then back to you, Dr. Khadija.
Azim, I think if you're talking about somehow having a Muslim politics where we bring international issues to the fore when we are talking to candidates or MPs, I think we did that at the time of the Respect coalition or party, or however we describe that, and we've done it over years with regard to Palestine as well. And I think the bottom line is it's not just Muslims who don't get a say in foreign policy. It is actually the way the politics of this country is set up. I mean, we used to literally be taught this. I'm a bit older than you guys. That, the British electorate can only really speak if you believe that it ever was able to speak to domestic issues, okay, international issues, foreign affairs, is the preserve of the government of the day and the kind of establishment that is there, regardless of whichever government is in power, right? So I think we have to not really look in that direction when it comes to these issues that we want justice for. I think we have to be able to, reimagine a way of doing politics, of having transformation, which is not, again, going back to this idea of your MP or political parties or the ballot box. And there isn't a way around this. I wish I had the sort of silver bullet to say, actually, we shouldn't do this, we should do that. But it's going to take a lot of thinking and a lot of really serious work, not just on the part of Muslims and Muslim thinkers domestically. It's got to be connected up as to how we can challenge really corrupt, unjust systems and establishments. I don't know that there's really a place. I mean, I think we saw the closest any kind of movement got to this political movement was that of Jeremy Corbyn. And we saw how quickly that was shut down. And, with all respect to it, it wasn't all that radical. And yet it was kind of completely closed down. There was no space for any kind of discussion about a just or foreign policy. I remember when Robin Cook announced shortly after New Labour won in 1997 that New Labour were going to have an ethical foreign policy, and literally every journalist in the room bursting out in laughter. And his own resignation over the Iraq war was really testament to the fact that, that's why people were laughing. So I think, the joke has not just been on Muslims, it's been on everybody. And how do we turn that understanding both into a connection with all the other people who have been marginalized and minoritized? Because at the moment, we're all kind of set off in a fight against each other because of the resurgence of this kind of very nationalistic rhetorics in the right and the left as well. And then turning that connection into something to move forward with. And as I said, I don't have those answers. I do think, as Khadija said, and I've said elsewhere, Thursday is a time to maybe give the parties a bloody nose, but, come Friday, so what? At least they know that we're angry, but what happens next?
Khadija, do you have anything to add on this moment in Palestine and what it might mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think I broadly agree that, in terms of foreign policy, I think we all know that none of us are going to make any impact, and that it's a foregone conclusion that the establishment calls the shots and decides how things are going to go in terms of direction. I think this moment, the nature of how information and content is being shared through social media, has been a real it's been notable in terms of how much access people have to visual sort of information about exactly what's going on the ground, and I think that's mobilized a lot of people. It's not the first time people have been mobilized around Palestine, but I think what's been interesting this time has also been how people are making connections between this foreign policy, our engagement on the international arena, and how that impacts domestic policy as well. And by that I mean very draconian approaches to policing protest or policing expression, or policing Muslimness specifically, and the connection of that between that and what's going on in Palestine. I think there's been awareness around that, and I think there's been political campaigning around that. And we've seen that, so I think that's another notable thing. Which look, it's interesting. I hope I'm wrong, but my concern is after the election, the momentum that's been gathering is going to die down. And I think, unfortunately, the nature of election campaigning also is such that, there's this huge buzz, and candidates will, campaign. And then, to be honest, I'm sure they're all burnt out by the Friday, right? And, those of them who haven't won, which, let's face it, the vast majority, we'll probably get 1 or 2 independents that get through. That's just the nature of the game, maximum, if we're lucky. Everybody else is going to go home and say, okay, I gave my best shot. And, what do we, it's great that there's been momentum around Palestine. But the real question is what's going to happen after the election, because we're not going to change British foreign policy, but what can we change? And those, everybody who's, the very many independents that have put their names forward, sometimes several in one constituency, and that's a whole other conversation. What are they going to do then? I mean, how are these people going to, how are they going to put their money where their mouth is? Basically, if you're really that committed to your constituency, which you'd like us to believe you are when you were out on the campaign trail, surely it's not just, a one-off event then in the run-up to the election. Are you only committed to your constituency because you want them to vote for you, or are you truly committed in the long run? And what's that going to translate into? How is that going to manifest in terms of these issues, Palestine and others, after the election?
Thank you. It's hard not to feel.
I'm really sorry for being so depressed.
No. The thing is, I'm with the both of you exactly on every single point that you've made, and I think that it is quite depressing in that regard, because the options are so palpably limited for us all. We're all so invested in our own futures, the futures of our family, of our friends, the futures of our neighbors. We're invested in the future of Palestine, and so there's a lot at stake. And I think that's, when I'm listening to both of you, I get a sense of that, and I think that's one of the reasons why, so consistently there have been these kind of moments, and both you, Khadija, in your thread, and Arzu in your article, you're highlighting for us all how perennial this is. It just keeps on coming back again and again and again. This idea of, well, this time we can make a change. This time we can make a difference. This time we can vote strategically or really come together in order to achieve X, Y, or Z end. But what ends up happening is it's so much the opposite of that. It is, entirely this idea that we have normalized a system and a structure of violence, so that the way that it lands and hits and hurts our body is magnified to a greater extent, because we realize how limited our options actually were. And in that regard, Fahad, I'm glad that you can join us now. I know you were a bit busy, but I know you were listening in. Fahad, how can we then conceive of a politics that is more radical? How can we actually live that as a praxis, as a lived tradition, rather than just simply putting all of our eggs into that political basket and then feeling completely dispirited when we know what the outcome is already going to be?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, good evening, and my apologies for joining you so late. I just had some responsibilities I couldn't get out of. First, Yasim, thank you for organizing the space. I think within the hysteria that is out there at the moment, it's always good to find a safe space to have a counter narrative and speak certain things that people don't like to discuss. And because very often, as we see, people are inside their bubbles. And in this particular subject, they're inside the Westminster bubble. And when you are inside that bubble and there's hysteria all around you, it's often difficult to see a way out, to see another solution. Now, I mean, I heard bits and pieces of what Arzu and Khadija were saying, and I echo everything they've said. My only sort of caveat would be that I could be wrong if I didn't hear this being said, but I think it's actually quite positive in one sense that the community does feel passionate enough that they are mobilizing into action. The difficulty I have is that the direction they're mobilizing into. We have come to a state where the lesser of two evils has become a mantra that justifies absolutely every act of foolishness, where we feel that, well, it's a lesser of two evils, and that's as far as we aspire to. You know, we are a community that the greatest of messengers, the greatest of creation was sent to guide us, to teach us to be leaders of the world. The most courageous military commander in history, the most intelligent politician of all time, was sent to us. And we are told that we are to follow his example. And how have we come from that stage to where we are looking at two embodiments of evil and saying, well, this is the lesser of the two, so let's go for that? What has happened to the imagination? What's happened to the ability to think outside of that spectrum? And that's what concerns me. Now, one of the things, that discussions I've recently been having, people have said, well, why not have both? You know, you advocate towards other solutions, which we can come on to in a moment, but why can't you also have Westminster as a platform, essentially, to advocate for Gaza or whatever issue of justice and you want to bring up? My difficulty with this is twofold. Firstly, unless you're going to be like someone like Claire Daly, the Irish former member of the European Parliament.
This space was downloaded via spacesdown.com. Visit to download your spaces today.
Who's literally utilized her platform in the European Parliament to advocate for political causes that she felt strongly about. And she didn't believe in the system. And even when she lost her seat in the recent elections, she actually said, well, look, this is just one platform to advocate from. And the movement continues across different platforms that we just carry on. She didn't see it, and she didn't believe in the system as something that's going to bring about change or bring about good. She saw it as an avenue from which she could actually disrupt. I am reluctant to believe that all of these independents running are going to be like Claire Daly. And inevitably, you will have a situation where you have even people with outside of Westminster who are the most ardent advocates for justice. But once they fall within the Labour Party or in the Westminster bubble, they become corrupted by the system, because the system is designed to corrupt you. And you lose good people in that process. And there are numerous examples. So we don't need to name names, but there's numerous examples that we can all think of. The second problem I have with this is that we unfortunately have become a nation who like to traverse the path of least resistance. And there's no pun intended in that. You have multiple options to our community. So you can give them, here is an option: you can protest on Saturdays, a licensed carnival protest. You can do sit-ins. You can take direct action against the Elbit factories and their sponsors. You can engage in BDS. You can vote. You can engage in parliamentary politics. And when you look at the panoply of options available to the community, and then you measure that against how much time and effort is put into each option that's on the table, and you can see for yourself that the vast majority is pushing towards parliamentary elections, despite the fact that it is probably the least effective of all the methods that we've mentioned. But if all the other options that we've mentioned, the government is or is about to or wants to criminalize it, they want to marginalize it, they want to ostracize people who get engaged in it. Yet the only option they're happy for us to carry on doing is voting in parliamentary elections. And that's just some food for thought. Why would the establishment want you to engage in this process as a means of liberating Gaza, for example, where all other avenues are being closed off for you? And my disappointment with the community is that if you had even 1/10 of the scholars, the community leaders, the activists mobilizing towards direct action, for example, Palestine Action. Palestine Action is a classic example. You have literally a few dozen actionists, individuals who are courageous enough to say, we want to shut down Elbit systems in this country. These are weapons factories which are directly involved in the genocide. Okay, so how do we go about shutting down these weapons factories? What are the options? A, you lobby the government, you lobby the political classes to stop this happening. How long has that been going on, and what kind of impact has it had? B, you bring a legal action to, for example, not directly Elbit, but arms licenses to weapons being sold to Israel. You bring legal action to stop that happening. It takes months and months and months to get anywhere. Number two, generally you end up losing in court. And number three, even if you succeed, it's always on a technicality, so they'll just change the goalposts and they'll carry on selling. Elbit direct action, what does that do? What has their success rate been? Within the last 7 or 8 months, they have shut down 3 or maybe 4 factories. They have not just attacked the factories, they've attacked anybody invested within the Elbit ecosystem. So the recruiters for Elbit, the sponsors of Elbit, anybody who has any role in it, to the extent that even when it comes to Israeli weapons and investment in Israel, Barclays has had to pull out of sponsoring very, very significant raves and dance festivals because performers were refusing to participate while Barclays was a sponsor. That's enormous. And that's only come about because of the actions of PAL Action. Now, this is a few dozen people willing to go to prison for their beliefs to stop this genocide. Imagine the scholars, imagine the mosques, imagine the community mobilized and try to get the tens and hundreds of thousands of people around the country who they're getting to tick a box on Thursday. Imagine they asked them to go and join PAL Action. What impact would that have? But because it's risky, because you might get arrested, because it's not a safe option, people are more willing to actually gravitate towards voting. It's similar even when you talk about political campaigning. Many Muslims will only campaign for causes of oppression that are in line with US foreign policy. Example is, of course, the Uyghurs in China. Because this is going against China is consistent with US foreign policy and British foreign policy, it's actually an easy campaign to get involved in. You'd ask those people to get involved in other campaigns which are not so popular, it's very, very difficult. Palestine's an exception, of course, but if you talk about other campaigns around the world, people are reluctant. Why? Because it involves risk. So my disappointment to the community is that if we're going to present all these options, inevitably everyone's going to go towards the safest option. So I think take away that safe option completely. We shouldn't even be talking about it. Where is our imagination? We should be talking about bigger things than this. It's just a corrupt system that's designed to corrupt. And the only way to get around it is not to try to change it within. It doesn't change from within. You cannot change a corrupt system from within. It will just devour you, it will consume you, and it will spit you out. And you won't be the same person when you come out of it. So my thoughts on this, sorry to go off on a bit of a rant here, but my thoughts are that we need to actually use our imagination. We need to be brave. We need to be courageous. We need to start looking at solutions outside of Westminster. It is one of those things that we're so deeply embedded, invested in this, that we can't think of any other way. And that is not the way of the community that of an ummah that was described as the best of nations. How can we be the best of nations and then we subscribe and invest heavily in a corrupt system that even those who set it up are disillusioned with?
Jazakallah khair. That was very, very eloquent, Fahad. Brilliantly put. When you were talking about the slowness of the legal system, I know I've quoted this before in the past, but I always come back to James Baldwin and what he writes in The Fire Now about the NAACP and the approach that they took in terms of trying to bring actions against different institutions, and how long that takes, how protracted the whole process becomes. And so when you're so heavily invested in using the system to protect your rights, when you know that the system and structure has fundamentally failed you in the way that it is conceived, then you're constantly up against it. Because by the time you get a small victory in one small space, the goalposts have shifted so dramatically elsewhere that you're always behind. You're never in front at any point. And it also got me thinking of a meeting that I was in. I think it was maybe a week and a half ago now. I won't mention the sister or her father because I never asked permission to share this in terms of what she shared with us. But her father's a political prisoner in the Middle East, and the sister who's an activist for her father, she mentioned that there were US policymakers who were inviting her to come and speak to them about her father's case. They wanted to get involved, they wanted to help, they wanted to kind of, put their resources behind her father and herself. And her response was not only to them, but also to her own campaign team, is that regardless of what these people are offering us, right now there is a genocide taking place in Gaza, and we cannot be seen to be aligning with them for the sake of my father when they are involved in what is going on in Palestine right now. That my father is okay, and his own ethics would never allow us to prioritize his freedom over what is taking place in Palestine. That moved me so deeply, and I really couldn't imagine so many of our Muslim organizations in the UK who would think like that, who would have the thought and the ethics to sacrifice and to disengage, to actively disengage for the sake of the saving of human life, of Muslim life, of Christian life, of Palestinian lives, for with that goal in mind. And it really did make me think of the some of the limitations that we have in the way that we teach not only ethics but even Tawheed itself. And so, I think we've been going for almost an hour, and I appreciate people's patience, especially when we had some technical problems. But I want to ask all three of our speakers about what an active disengagement might look like for us, and how we might be able to bring that about, and for what effect. And Father, we can stay with you first if you like.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is all about. This has been triggered by Gaza. This is what we're talking about. We all admire the steadfastness, the resilience, the courage of the Palestinians, and what their disengagement with the political process has shown and proven is that the political process that they were invested in, or elements of the Palestinian people invested in, and where they were told this is the only way forward, only resulted in further humiliation, in degradation, and in entrenching the occupation. The only time that the Palestinians have ever achieved respect, global respect, is when they have actually gone against the grain and gone against the system, is what they've done now, resisting. The 7th of October operation went against everything that they were told they were supposed to do. And it sent shockwaves around the world. But what has been the impact? They've sacrificed. They have sacrificed in ways that we cannot even begin to relate to. But the impact for their cause, for their struggle, has been a global awakening. I mean, never before I don't think any of us have seen the whole world unite for Palestine the way it has now. This hasn't come through the ballot box. This hasn't come through democratic elections. This has come through grassroots mobilization, inspired by the grassroots resistance in Palestine. And that's why I think we need to sort of take a leaf out of their book and think, okay, we need to go against the system. If the system is democratic, petitioning and all this, then that's not going to work. Let's move away from that. Let's think broader. Let's use our imagination the way the Palestinians have, and that will bear fruit. I think we have to get out of that's the disengagement. We have to disengage with the system and develop new innovative solutions. It will take time, it will take effort, but until we liberate our minds first and foremost, I'm going to say now, I'm going to use that my favorite quote from Steve Biko, that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And that, if you heard nothing else from me today, just remember that quote from Biko, because that is critical to us liberating ourselves first and foremost, and then hopefully being an instrument to liberate the Palestinians.
Sister Azu, can I ask you to perhaps share some thoughts about what an active disengagement might look like for us?
Bismillah, first of all, I was really very heartened to hear the case you mentioned of the sister and her response, because I think, if we're honest, we've had a decade or more of Palestine being parked in the interests of different causes. And as Fahad said, we've often aligned with US foreign policy, both as organizations here, but as movements worldwide. And it's time that kind of behavior has to end. And I'm glad that there's a movement in that direction. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and it occurred to me as I was talking, I'm talking about myself first, not about anyone or anyone else, is that when we have these conversations about what is it that we can do and so on and so forth, we are kind of in a way ignoring the fact that so much is being done by, and I say this as an individual, the resistance in Palestine and its supporters in the region. And now we have an issue, and that's the way why I phrased it this way, as I'm speaking as an individual, is because for years now, we have allowed that discourse to be demonized and criminalized in this country. And maybe we have to ask ourselves questions, because we're very quick to jump up and down and go, Nelson Mandela used to be called a terrorist, etc., and, look, we had to push back on that and all the rest of it. And let's park a whole conversation about South Africa for another time. But maybe there's something here that we can actually learn. Because when we do this, if we are not really going to acknowledge the people who are laying down their lives, we sort of kind of circumvent that. And we are talking about Palestinians as victims and women and children, right? That women and children as all one word that we know about as a way of not talking about difficult things in the kind of situations we're in. And we are in difficult situations. I'm not trying to undermine the fact that we are in tricky situations in countries like the UK when it comes to the anti-terrorism regime that's been used to suppress dissent of any sort in this country. If we're going to allow that to keep happening, we are undermining something that's already happening, to where people are giving their lives inside and outside of Palestine for that cause. So, let's have a pause and let's think how we can actually support the normalization of the ethics of that disengagement that Fahad has been talking about just now really eloquently. And thank you, Fahad, for, articulating that in ways that, I've been struggling to for thus far. Going forward, maybe that's the way we have to really, think about some of the damage we've done ourselves and actually try and articulate, however difficult it might be. And I'm not talking about communities now, I'm talking about the organizations that we've all been in, to actually come, maybe connect more with this. I've said this on my own, so if there's going to be blame anywhere attributed to anything that has been said by me, it's to me alone. Shall I leave it there and then come back if there's time later?
Sure, thank you. Khadija.
Yeah, just to, I think both Arzu and Fahad have made really, really important points. I think I'd absolutely agree with what Fahad said about we have this a very chronic feature in our communities where we always lean towards the path of least resistance. It's always our path of choice. And there are very good reasons for that. There are good reasons why we've become like that over time. But I think interrogating that and really calling it out for what it is a start. We need to ask ourselves, why? Why do we keep doing that? The earlier generations may have had reasons, whether they were good or bad, for doing that. Does that mean we have to always choose the low risk, the low stakes? What does that mean, and what's that sort of incrementally going to do to our imaginations, as you said, what's going to do how is this becoming ingrained in our psyches and how we think of ourselves and how we look at ourselves in relation to our societies, and not just in terms of our aspirations but also our obligations. Um, I think there's that mental work that needs to be done, um, uh, really unpacking that and thinking about it. And I think part of that is, you know, we've all talked about the energy and the momentum around election time, but I think what I would call on people, individuals, but also collectives and organizations, institutions, leaders to do is to really think of the power and the potential that we have in our hands in the everyday. So don't limit how you think of politics um, just to that little window of time where you've actually been granted permission by the establishment to express yourself, namely the election period. We don't need to wait for people. We don't need to wait for politicians to tell us, yes, you can, put on your politics hat now and think about politics. We can listen to you. You can have your say now because we've allowed you to have your say. We can have our say whenever we want to. There are so many ways that we can make our voices heard, and we should really be thinking about that as Muslims who want to practice our faith holistically in the everyday. It's part of our life. It's part of our worship, right? Um, so organizations, for instance, like the Muslim Vote, it's a grassroots organization, but also other collectives, other groupings that are locally. I've seen plenty in different constituencies. Um, they need to own their claims and their rhetoric about being a voice um, for um, for Muslim issues, or for issues for the benefit of society as a whole. Speaking from a standpoint of Islamic values, you can't just claim to be that for 1 month and then stop when the establishment tells you to be quiet. What are you going to do in the long run? I think that's really a challenge, but I think it's the only it's the only option of integrity that these collectives can really have if they want to live up to the values that they claim that they're championing. So that's the challenge, but it's also actually to flip it a little bit and be a little bit positive. It's also quite exciting when you think of the possibilities about what people can achieve if they really put their mind to it and think outside the box and be creative and be brave and be bold. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, that's actually perfect. That creativity is something we're in desperate need of. I want to give you all a minute or so to share some final remarks, but just as a word from myself, I think I've been so impressed by some of the discourse that we've seen from younger Muslims in particular over the last almost a year now. We're going to, in October, coming up to a year um, of this genocide taking place, and it's actually quite heartening to see how much a younger generation has understood that it doesn't have to be tied to old establishment ways of thinking, that there are ways of thinking outside of working in traditional politics. I've visited a number of the student encampments, and really it's incredible to see young people turning up and saying that, well, actually, our careers are not the be all and end all of everything. This university education is meaningless if we do not make a stand while we are watching a genocide taking place right in front of us. Like, what is all this education worth if it has no bearing on our values and the way that we operate and move through this earth? And I think that's such an incredible thing. And to see the diversity of people that are at these encampments, standing up for justice, standing up for what they believe is right, connecting, especially in the case of Muslims, connecting their faith directly to their actions in this world. It's very heartwarming. It actually gives me a lot of hope for the future. In that regard, inshallah, next week, Cage will be releasing a Conscious Muslim Guide. It's kind of our attempt to help people think about the different areas of their lives and their struggles that they can connect to making a difference in this world. We feel that it was with the kind of range of experience that we have over the years, that it's time that we, kind of set out a document that provides individuals and maybe even organizations with a set of values and, I guess, ideas for how they might think differently about how they engage with the world. So hopefully when we release that, it'll be interesting to see, what others have to add to such a document, what their own thoughts are in relation to what does it mean to live as a conscious Muslim, walking through this earth, especially when we're seeing so much harm done to our own people. But, perhaps in the order of Sister Arzu, then Khadija, then Fahad, I'd like to ask you to please just share some final thoughts, especially, we're 2 days away from the election. Are there any thoughts about the election or thinking beyond the election that you'd like to share?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think let's think beyond the elections. In fact, let's not even think about the elections. Let's think about the big picture and how we make those connections with not just Palestine, but everywhere where we see people actually turning the situation around, turning the narrative around, and kind of realizing that actually we're sitting here in the UK and kind of thinking that we may be somehow in a better position and able to do things more because it's the UK. This colonial idea of parliamentary democracy and civil society, etc., it's been living rent-free in our heads for way too long. I think we have to maybe understand our limitations and also see all the examples in the rest of the world where even under the most extreme circumstances, people are frankly more liberated than us in creating a transformed world. We have to have that self-reflection. I think let's not beat up on communities and ordinary people who are right to be worried and scared in the kind of really suppressive system that we're living in, oppressive systems that we're living in. If we're going to be critical, let's be critical about the leadership that we've had and about our own culpability in that, to be honest. And I know this is weird because I'm usually the very pessimistic one, but out of this moment of sheer horror, I think we can see a new world already rising because this one has now been so thoroughly exposed. The corruption of it is evident for all but very few who are invested in it to see that, we now have a possibility, despite and sadly because of the sacrifice and all the blood, of actually having a transformed future. So, the ball is in our court in many ways, but we just have to see where it is exactly we are in relation to that new future.
So yeah, just to add to that, I think that absolutely resonates. Arzu, I wanna also, you mentioned student encampments, and I think for me that is something that's really exceptional that's come out of this moment, because what that demonstrates to us, it gives me a lot of hope, and I think one of the things that it gives me hope for is that it shows how many young people are unencumbered by the considerations that the older generations used to really factor in. And when I say older, I mean even my own generation. I think, I was an undergraduate during the time of the Iraq War, and we, of course there were student movements, but nothing like the sight of the encampments that we see today. We just did not have, there were reasons why, but we did not have that kind of, attitude where we just didn't allow, these guys they're just not allowing themselves to be constrained by restrictions, by rules, by expectations. And I think that's something for us all to pause and study and think about and learn from. Of course, everybody has their own sphere of influence in their own area that they sort of engage with in their everyday life. But in terms of the attitude, the sincerity of it, the sort of the how emancipated it is. And when I say emancipated, I mean mentally, emotionally, logically, rationally. People aren't allowing themselves to be constrained by what the done thing is or what they're allowed, the parameters within which they're allowed to make their voices heard. I think there's a lot that we can take from that. And at the end of the day, I think we have organizations, collectives, institutions. They can be on board with this, or they can choose not to be. But ultimately, we're all, I think we all need to look to ourselves and think about what is the change that we can affect um, in our own lives, and the people that we interact with. And I think if that's something that people can take away, then that would be really good as well.
Bismillah. At the height of the Crusades, when Masjid al-Aqsa and Palestine was occupied by the Crusaders, Nuruddin Zengi, one of the great Muslim leaders, he had a mimbar constructed. And this was a time when to even think about a liberated Palestine, liberated Al-Aqsa was impossible. But he had a mimbar erected, constructed for the masjid, so that when it was liberated, this would be the mimbar for the masjid. I think we need to start doing that, not constructing mimbars, but thinking of a post-Zionist world, a post-Zionism state, because we are going towards that. We are at a tipping point, I feel. And if we carry on sort of looking at, well, how can we help feed the people in Gaza, which all of this is important, the Band-Aid, giving them aid, helping them, even to this now, people, activists in the community still talk about two-state solution. Like it's just incredibly naive, but they feel they can, their vision does not extend beyond that. And I think everybody who cares about Palestine needs to be looking at how do we deal with a post-Israel world? What happens then? And if we start focusing on that, inevitably our actions will change. How we view, how we behave, our dynamics towards Westminster elections, everything else, it becomes a reality. We won't care. We know it's meaningless. The apartheid, the original apartheid in South Africa, did not end in its format at that point. It did not end because Britain voted against it or there was parliamentary pressure. It ended because of grassroots movements across the world who could see a post-apartheid South Africa, like the encampments today. So I think we need to actually embody that spirit. Our kids will see it, our children, young people will see it. And in fact, they are the ones who are teaching us now. You see the people graduating from university, everyone's bringing a Palestine flag. It's just catching. It's become, I don't want to use the word trendy, but that's essentially what it has. You saw Glastonbury recently, and the Zionists were just, having kittens over the fact that there was Palestine flags everywhere, and artists were talking about Palestine. We're at that point now. So now's not the time to go defensive again. We need to carry on and just think, you know what? It's just a matter of time. Israel's finished. And the only way it's going to finish is to carry on supporting the resistance, support the resistance movements in this country, the resistance movement in Palestine. We betray them by not talking about them. We betray their sacrifices by eviscerating them from the conversation. Because it's because of the resistance in Palestine that we are even having this discussion today. They are the ones who have brought Palestine back onto the dinner table to have a discussion about it. No one cared about it on October the 6th. Nobody was talking about Palestine. Now the whole world is. And that's only because of the courage, of the resilience, of the honor of those people who have resisted against Israel. And I think we owe it to them, and we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the cause to not forget them when we talk about this conversation. They should be headlining any conversation we have on Palestine. And I think that is almost the last, hurdle we have to cross before we try to liberate our own minds. So I think let's not forget the resistance. Always, always, always support the resistance in Palestine against Zionism and envision a Zionist-free world.
Inshallah. Somebody recently said to me, better than a two-state solution is a one-state solution, and better than a one-state solution is a no-state solution. And I think that goes to the point that you make about having an imagination, that we need to have these imaginations beyond what we're constricted by. And I very much took those words to my heart, and I'm trying to practice them in the way that I think about what my own politics are moving forward. My sincere apologies to anybody who wants to ask a question. I'm afraid that we have to bring this discussion to a close, but my sincere thanks to Mr. Arz Marali, to Brother Fahad Ansari and Dr. Khadija Shayal. You've been brilliant. I think you've given everybody a lot to think about going forward, not just in terms of the election, but well beyond the election. What does it look like to have a genuine conscious politics for Muslims and beyond in the UK? And it's something that hopefully people will keep on coming back to. Hopefully the recording will stay on the Cage account, so hopefully you can share it around, and other people can benefit from it. But we want to do more of these spaces, so do follow Cage's work, and inshallah we'll have some more brilliant speakers that will host in future discussions soon. Jazakumullah khair, everybody. Hope you have an amazing evening, and inshallah we'll be in touch again soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
This space was downloaded via spacesdown.com. Visit to download your spaces today.